Good evening, everyone, and welcome to How We Got Here with myself, Joshua Garry. I'm just going to quickly hide my video. I don't like looking at myself whilst I'm speaking. So, for those who haven't been with us before, Garry, and I'm the course facilitator. If you ever see me in the street, I prefer to be called Josh. Only my mother calls me Joshua when I've done something wrong. So, how we got here, the course, the key aims of the course, and what we've been trying to cover what we are going to cover over the next 7 weeks. The first thing I really wanted to get across was the presence of Africans in Britain. And I hope that from the past two sessions, it becomes very clear that colour have always been a part of British history. The Romans, or the Afro-Romans, were in fact here before the English were here. And even when you look into the Tudor period and the early modern period, there's a clear presence of Africans. And hopefully that should start to challenge the myth that Britishness is solely tied to whiteness. In today's session, we're going to look at the construction of race. And we're going to ask ourselves, where did racism come from? Or at least, where did racism come from in terms of blackness and whiteness? So last week, we learned about the Africans in Tudor England, and we had some really, really amazing and fascinating stories. We had the story of Jack Francis to the left of me, and how his story is a key indicator of the status of Africans who are living in England at the time, which shows that in Tudor England, slavery didn't exist. Africans who lived in Tudor England were free men. You have the amazing story of John Blank, who asked for a pay rise from Henry VIII and is in fact granted one. And what I really like about that story is it shows that there were Africans in rather significant positions within society. And my favorite story, the one that really captured my imagination as a young man growing up, is the story of Diego, and how he worked with Sir Francis Drake to defeat the Spanish, to rob the Spanish, to pirate against the Spanish, and to eventually settle down in Plymouth, England. And what you have in all of these stories, you have amazing stories of how migration, how how Africa migrated from Africa, how they migrated from Portugal, Spain, Southern Europe, and how they eventually found themselves in England. Today's lesson: where do our ideas of race come from? And I think this is really, really interesting. Key terms for today's lesson. The first term is race, and race is a grouping of humans based on, shared physical or social qualities into categories. So race, you may look at the black race, you may look at the white race, for example. And enslavement is a very, very important term. You don't just use the word slaves. When you talk about enslavement, you're talking about the action of taking someone who was once free and forcing them into a position of slavery. And that's what happened with the transatlantic trade. These Africans were brothers, mothers, fathers, farmers, soldiers, and they became slaves. They are not slaves, and they became slaves because they were forced. Now, I want to start this session with a rather interesting story, and one that really, really captures the imagination and kind of brings this story to front. In 1618, the English explorer, Captain Richard Jobson, was met in Senegambia in West Africa, and he went there in search of gold. And when he went to Senegambia, he was offered enslaved African women by African slave trader Boko Sanu. Captain Richard refused, saying the English were a people who did not deal in any such commodities. Neither did we buy or sell one another or any that had our shapes. It's really interesting, this. Boko replied, why it was that English refused to trade in slaves when other white men earnestly desired them, especially such young women. So right now we have a conversation, we have an interaction between two people in the 1600s. You've got the English explorer, Captain Jobson, and he's being offered slaves. And he's saying, no, the English do not deal slaves at all. We don't sell human beings who are like ourselves. And there's a saying that really, really captures the idea here. He said, we are of a different kind to the Europeans. The Europeans aren't like us. And William Murray had a really, really interesting quote. He says, "The air in England is too pure for a slave to breathe. And so everyone who breathes it becomes free. Everyone who comes to this island is entitled to the protection of English law, whatever oppression he may have suffered, whatever may be the color of his skin." And this is quite interesting, because when we're looking at Diego, who came from Panama, when he came to England, this is apparently true. He became a free man. So the question I ask us is this: how did we Anyway, the question I ask us then is, how did we go from this, a situation where you had the English and Africans working with each other, to the situation we have on the right? The campaign piece created by Josiah Wedridge says, "Am I not a man and a brother?" How did we go from a country that said we do deal in slaves to a nation that became the second highest slave trading nation in the entire world? From the moment in 1618 when Richard Jobson recoiled at the mere suggestion of buying and selling enslaved Africans, half of all the Africans who were taken were English. I mean, half of all the Africans who were transported into slavery were transported because of British ships. And it wasn't until 1807 that it was abolished. And you had to still wait until 1832 before slavery and the selling of slaves became illegal. And in this, there are so many important things that are captured. How far did New World slavery turn Africans into Negroes? And I use that word, as derogatory as it might be, to capture the essence of what happened and to capture what happened with our understanding of race. How did human beings come to a position in society where they're seen as inferior? Then we ask further questions. Why did this lead to European sailors becoming white men? Quite often when we think about race, we only think about race in terms of Africans or Black people being inferior. But an important question to ask also is, how was whiteness created? And why did it lead to the idea that white people are in fact superior? And when looking at that asks us wider questions. And the wider questions it asks is this: did the Portuguese and become slavers because they are racist? Or did they become racist because they were slaves? And before I move on, I really want you to meditate and really think of that, because this question really captures where the idea of race as we know it came from, and where the idea that Africans were inferior to white people came from. Did the Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, and British become slaves because they are racist? Was this the primary reason? Did they always feel that white people were superior to Black people? The process of enslavement of Africans leads to them becoming racist. And finally, how Africans lead to the abolition of the slave trade? And for me, this is a really, really interesting question. Touch on the rather remarkable Fatima. Quite often when we look at the abolition of slavery in schools, often taught in a where the Africans are nothing more than the spectators. They are the passengers on the journey. And it was a change that was driven by white abolitionists. Like I said, history is not about facts. It's about asking questions, really, really engaging with interpretations of the past. I would argue, and a lot of people would argue, that not only were the enslaved Africans central to the abolition of the slave trade, I would argue that enslaved Africans fought against slavery from its very inception. From the moment that they were taken, from the moment they went onto the ships, they continued to fight. The amount of mutinies you had on the ships were phenomenal. There are so many. Now here you have a really, really remarkable figure. So her name is Cecile Fatima. And she's from the island of what we call Haiti today. Now, the Haitian Revolution, some would argue, and I would argue, probably one of the most significant revolutions in human history. It's the first and only time enslaved people were able to destroy and get rid of their oppressors and make themselves free. And during this remarkable event, the Haitian Revolution, you have Cecile Fatima and somebody called Patty Bookman. And they pretty much played a key part in starting the revolution. Fatima, she was a voodoo priestess. And in tradition, she made a prediction that the enslaved people in the island of Saint Domingue would overthrow slavery. And I find it very interesting because not only does it challenge the idea that, you know, enslaved Africans were passengers in the process of the abolition of the slave trade, it also really puts into focus the central role of women in this fight. Next lesson, you're going to find out a lot more about the resistance, but what you will see is women were central to this. And quite often when you think of masculine, when you think about fighting, you would traditionally associate it simply because of society's raised us. But once again, this will go on to further challenge those views. And it asks further questions. How far did the transatlantic slave trade lead to the underdevelopment of Africa? Because there's also this perception that Africa must have always been an underdeveloped society. But the consequences of enslavement on the continent were, and the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade will affect us till this day. What are the legacies of the transatlantic slave trade? When looking in the United Kingdom, quite often we do not know how the slave trade affected us. But when you look further, this becomes obvious. Cities such as London, Glasgow, Bristol, and Liverpool actually grew and flourished because of this. Canary Wharf was once known as the West India Docks, and the West India Docks were a key part of the transatlantic slave trade. But we will get into that slightly later. However, before I engage in the story of the transatlantic slave trade, which for me is trauma, for me is a very, very difficult story to grapple, simply because those people could have been me. I must start this story in Africa. The story, whenever you teach the story of the transatlantic slave trade, it must start in Africa. And the reason for it is this. As you will see, African history, started in the ancient times. You've got an empire of Tarseti, which was in 3400 BCE. The problem is, if you start teaching the transatlantic slave trade with slavery, you are reinforcing the false narrative that Africans were always inferior and Africans didn't have a history. And when you enforce that negative perception, this fosters ideas of racism, which we're going to engage with now. So, there's an African proverb which I really like. It goes, until a lion has a story of its own, tales of hunting will always be about the hunter. And this is a problem that Africa had for quite a long time. In this proverb is the continent of Africa, and the hunter will be the European colonial powers. And unfortunately, for a long period of time, the history of Africa had always been from the point of view of the Europeans, of the colonial powers. And what that did is it took the voice of Africans. And by taking away the voice of Africans, you do not get to hear their side of the story. You do not get to hear their interpretation, which is fundamental to understanding any story. Now, I find this really interesting. An Oxford historian, Hugh Redwell Trevor, and he was a historian from 2014 to 2003. Now, he primarily focused on early modern British history and Nazi history. However, he said that there is none or very little. There is only the history of Europeans in Africa. Could he be right? No, clearly. In order to investigate African histories, further evidence has to be used. What we need to understand is, in the 1400s, for example, the people living didn't think that in 100 years, people will be studying what we did. So they didn't necessarily write down all of their records, but they certainly recorded what happened, okay? When studying about the history of Africa, historians tend to use three different types of sources. We tend to use oral sources, songs, poems. We tend to use medieval written sources, which are often written by Europeans. And we also tend to use archaeological evidence. And when we use all of these three types of evidence in conjunction, use them together, you get a much clear picture of African history. And on the right, once again, there's a really interesting story about the ruins of the Great Zimbabwe. Now, the Great Zimbabwe was first discovered by European archaeologists. And when they discovered the Great Zimbabwe, they said it was no way possible. It was completely impossible for this amazing structure to have been built by Africans. So what they said, they created a lie where they said it was built by the Queen of Sheba after she left Solomon. Then there was a second turn in the story. Another European historian came and they tried to wipe away all information about the story of the Great Zimbabwe. They did not want to connect the African civilization with this. It was only recently, until recently, that we found that this amazing archaeological site was actually built by Africans. And that poses further interesting questions. A number of historians recently have been, have reported on fairly controversial issues. And I guess the question I've started to ask myself is, how much history has been hidden away? How much history has not been revealed? And the Great Zimbabwe is a great example of history that has been ignored, neglected, lied, for want of a better word. They've been dishonest with this part of history. Now, the history of the African continent covers thousands of years, thousands of kilometers, and millions of people speaking hundreds of languages. There are countless stories, dances, poems, songs that tell the history of great ancient civilizations. You have the ancient Egyptian empire. You have powerful kingdoms in West Africa, such as the Kingdom of Mali and the Kingdom of Songhai. Behind me, you have the Dejani Mosque at Tiwati. It was built by MANSA MUSA in the 14th century. And this is testament of some of the amazing architecture that existed in medieval Africa. Not only do you have mosques in this area, you also have centers for learning. You also have trading cities in medieval Africa. You have Timbuktu, you have Goa. You have enormous structures such as the pyramids in Giza and the Great Zimbabwe. However, one of the ancient kingdoms I find really interesting is the Kingdom of Tasseti. And this simply means the land of the bow, okay? Now, it was established 300 years before the first ancient Egyptian dynasty in 3000 BCE. Now, archaeologists have also discovered that hieroglyphics may have originated from Tasseti. And Tasseti can be found in modern-day Sudan. Now, the question is, why is this important? Why are you pointing to the Kingdom of Tasseti before we look at the ancient Egyptian dynasty? Well, quite a lot has been said about who built the pyramids, who invented hieroglyphics. And some people have argued that this history is not linked to Black Africans. Why, or what makes Tasseti so important is the fact that not only was it built before the ancient Egyptian dynasty, a number of practices within the ancient Egyptian dynasty came from Tasseti. The hieroglyphics, for example, the pyramids. And in that way, civilized and advanced ways of living can be tied to Africans living in Africa, which is very, very important because it shows that they have a history beyond the transatlantic slave trade, way before it. Here you've got a picture of Queen Nefertiti kissing her daughter, and this just goes on to further show how advanced they were in terms of art and things like that. Now, in the 1300s, you had Mansa Musa in the Kingdom of Mali, and Mansa Musa is probably one of my favorite individuals in medieval African history, and his story is truly remarkable. So on the right, to the right, you have what we call the Catalan Atlas, and the Catalan Atlas was by Abraham Cresc, and he was a Spanish man in the 14th century. Now, how did he know about King Mansa Musa? And why was King Mansa Musa's story so important to someone like him? Well, King Mansa Musa went on a famous pilgrimage to Mecca, a pilgrimage known as Hajj. That's what in Islam. And as Mansa Musa was making pilgrimage to Mecca, it was said that he had so much gold that wherever he went, the value of gold was destabilized, and economies were completely disrupted because of how wealthy he is. Some people argue that Mansa Musa was the most wealthy man to have ever lived. In this Catalan Atlas, you captured the European imagination and knowledge of Mansa Musa. You have Mansa Musa holding a gold coin. You have Mansa Musa with a gold crown. And stories about Mansa Musa and stories about Africa's immense wealth was one of the key factors that drove Europeans to Africa in the first place. They went to Africa in search of that wealth. They went to Africa to form strong military relationships to fight against the growing threat that they perceived of Islam. So at least in the 14th century, the Europeans not only had a positive image of Africa, there was an image of Africa that was associated with immense wealth. And that's rather interesting because I speak for myself, something that I don't know, I've got to be honest about. When I was growing up in the 90s, I didn't claim my African heritage. And what not claiming my African heritage is when you would turn on the television, you were bombarded with images of poverty, with images of famine, with images of destitution. And as a young man growing up, trying to, understand my identity and understand where I came from, I didn't necessarily want to associate myself with those images. I didn't see anything in Africa or the African history that I could be proud of. How about flipping that narrative? How about a 7-year-old boy being brought face to face with stories about Mansa Musa? That would create an immense source of pride within the young man. And why wouldn't you want to claim, or make links with such an amazing place? But these stories weren't told to me when I was younger. Not only did you have very, very advanced civilizations in West Africa, you equally had very, very advanced ancient civilizations in East Africa. You had the ancient kingdom of Kiwa Kiswani. Now, the empire of Kiwa Kiswani was one of the biggest in East Africa, and it's located in modern-day Tanzania. And it was built approximately in the 10th century. So that's approximately in 900. Right? Now, this is important once again because when you think about architecture, when you think about the development and civilization of Africa, these aren't images that come to mind. And these images are important because you ask yourself, in the medieval period, Africa in many ways was as advanced as Europe, if not more advanced than Europe in some ways. And European exploration might have been one of the advantages that Europeans had, but definitely in terms of religion, in terms of architecture, in terms of trade, they were just as advanced as their European counterparts. Now, the fortress was built by the Portuguese in the 1480s. Now, this is really interesting because when it was first built by the Portuguese, it was built in what is now today modern-day Ghana. And it was built to allow them to conduct trade. However, before they could build this fortress, they had to ask permission from the king in Ghana. And that is a very, very significant clue when looking at the power relationship between the two. And the irony is, what was once a fortress for trading, buying and selling things, later became a slave. In this image right here, you could already see the shift in relations between Europe and Africa in terms of power, in terms of development. You had Europeans needing support from Africans in order to build such structures. And then a couple of hundred years later, you have Europeans taking Africans and forcing them in enslavement and transporting them to the other side of the Atlantic. Now, we need to make clear to everyone is it's important to understand that the arrival of Europeans did not lead to them immediately dominating African communities and their kingdoms. Make no mistake, African warriors were formidable. When Europeans first arrived on the continent of Africa, firstly, most of them died as a result of tropical disease. That's the first thing to consider. The second thing to understand is they could only trade if they had the permission from the Obas. And the third thing, which I think is rather significant, is Europeans had to seek the protection from the medieval African kings because of the threat from the other rival kingdoms. So what you have here is a rather different story. You do not have a story of Europeans coming into Africa and completely dominating the continent, which was not the case. You have Europeans who are very, very dependent on the hospitality of the African kingdoms. They needed the African kingdoms because they died from many tropical diseases. The African kings had control and access to the water. Water is probably the most important substance we all need to survive. The Europeans needed to ask these kings for access to water. The Europeans needed to ask these kings before they could buy and sell things. And finally, the Europeans needed protection from these kings, from the other rival armies. Now, what does that say? That completely challenges our understanding of what Africa once was. Quite often, I know when I was growing up, I had the impression that Europeans, they discovered Africa, they went in and they started getting involved in the transatlantic slave trade. But no, what you actually find is that wasn't the case. And also, and that's very, very important to understand is when I started talking about this, I spoke about the ancient kingdom in Tarseti, which was around 3,400 BCE. That is almost 3,800 years of history before the transatlantic slave trade even begun. That shows how vast Africa's history actually was. Africa's history was this big. Slavery was about this big. But quite often, when we teach the story of slavery, we teach it like it's Africa's only history. And that's why before I started to proceed and talk about the transatlantic slave trade, I needed to give you a flavor for how vast, how advanced, how civilized, how amazing the African kingdoms truly were. Now, as I've already said, Europeans needed to seek permission from African traders, but another interesting dynamic where you really, really get to understand the power that these African rulers had is when we look at religion. Right here you have the King of Congo, Nzinga Memba, and in 1491 he converted to Christianity and he became known as King Alfonso I. However, make no mistake, when the King of Congo chose to adopt European religions, even when the West African kings chose to adopt Islam, they adopted these religions with an African twist, with an African element. And that frustrated Europeans, it frustrated Arabs, but what it really shows was that these religions could not be imposed. They could not be enforced on these African kingdoms. These African kings had to choose to accept it themselves. And when they did choose to accept it, they decided to practice it in a manner that was befitting for them. You also have this rather remarkable portrait of somebody called Dom Miguel de Castro, the ambassador of the King of Garcia II in Brazil. Okay, now I find this really interesting because King Garcia II, he was the king of Congo. And what this starts to show is the diplomatic link that Congo had. They were able to send ambassadors all the way to Brazil. They were able to interact with Portuguese people. And what you're starting to understand is Africa was a rather, should I say, globalized area. And I don't really like talking about Africa because Africa, the term Africa is pretty much a European concept. And Africa is not a country, it's a continent with over 50 countries. And even back then, those countries didn't exist back then and before we know it today. But the point I'm really trying to stress and get across to you is that even Africa's relationships with the rest of the world weren't only positive, they were also developed. Now here, I really love this, okay? And this is a 16th century cross from Congo. And as you can see, if you look closer at this cross, you have a depiction of Jesus. But Jesus is depicted in this cross as a black man. And this shows the relationships that these kingdoms had with Europeans. They dictated how religion was going to be practiced. They practiced religion on their terms. And this goes on to further support the argument that they were in control, they were in power. And the Europeans and the Arabs alike, they are very annoyed with how religion was practiced, but they have aims. However, you had African kingdoms that adopted Christianity way before the transatlantic slave trade began. You had the Oxum Empire in Ethiopia. They adopted Christianity in around the 4th century. This was almost 1,300 years before slavery came to Africa. In fact, the Ethiopian or the Oxum Empire was one of the first regions to adopt Christianity, and they still practice the Orthodox Christian religion today. So you already have complex stories. You've got kingdoms that adopted Christianity or adopted Islam, but practiced them in the way they saw fit as a result of contact with Europeans. You have regions in Africa who adopted Christianity way before they had contact with Europeans. And then you also have kingdoms in Africa who completely rejected Christianity or any other religion. And one of those examples is the Kingdom of Benin. And when looking at the Kingdom of Benin, it is a really, really interesting story. We're looking at how Africa and Africans resisted European domination of the continent. Benin was one of the first regions that the Europeans came into contact with. And it's located in what is now today modern day Nigeria and Cameroon. Now, what I must make clear is the Obas who are the kings of Benin, they didn't choose to reject Christianity or reject Islam for reasons that were altruistic, for reasons that I should say were the benefit of their people. What a lot of people fail to understand is religion is very, very closely connected with power. It's very, very closely connected with controlling people, especially in the Middle Ages. Now, the Obas, as I said in last week, they claimed to be gods, right? They were divine. And this was important because this prevented your everyday person from trying to kill them. So they couldn't take on Christianity. They couldn't take on Islam because by taking on Christianity or by taking on Islam, they would completely undermine their positions as rulers, as being half God. And this idea is not too dissimilar to what we had in Europe. For example, Henry VIII and the idea of the divine right of kings, the idea that God chose who was going to be the king. And so if you killed the king, it was a major sin known as regicide. These ideas are nothing new. Kings have always claimed to come from God or claim to be gods. But I just think in these three stories, we have, three interesting contrasts. We have kingdoms who accepted Christianity, but on their terms. We have kingdoms who practice foreign religions way before they were introduced. And you had kingdoms who completely rejected them. And the point being, the Europeans had no power whatsoever in forcing the Yorubas of Benin to accept Christianity. And that's important because that captures the idea of Europeans being very, very somewhat subservient to the African kings at the time. Now, The Portuguese had established, trading posts from the 1490s, okay? But once again, unlike many other kingdoms in West Africa, the Benin Empire actually refused to sell slaves. They refused to engage in the transatlantic slave trade. The Obas, in fact, barred the sale of male slaves, and they only deal with Europeans primarily on textiles. Once again, I am picking up the power that these kingdoms had. Europeans couldn't force the Obas of Benin to take on slavery. They couldn't force the king of Congo to take on slavery. They couldn't force the rulers in Dahomey, in Mali, or in Songhai to take on slavery. They couldn't force it. And not only could they not force it, trade between Africa and Europe existed with many commodities. They traded in gold, they traded in wax, they traded in spices, they traded in horses. Enslaved Africans was one part of it, but that wasn't all of the transatlantic, or that wasn't all of the relationship, the trading relationship between these two people. Now, unfortunately, what happened to Benin is, although Benin refused to engage in the transatlantic slave trade, their neighboring regions, all their neighboring rival kingdoms engaged in the transatlantic slave trade. And what happened over a period of time was Europeans stopped trading with Africa, exchanging commodities such as horses, such as wax, such as textiles. And this trade became solely about enslaved Africans. And that completely weakened the position of the Benin Empire, because if all your other rivals are trading in slaves and you're not trading in slaves, your economy will not function. You will not have money coming in. And over the course of a number hundred years, the Benin Empire collapsed. And when it collapsed, it was eventually colonized by the British in the 1800s. And when it was colonized by the British, you have these bronzes here. And one of the remarkable stories about it is the British took these bronzes and put them in the British Museum. Now, in the 1400s, this would have been unimaginable. In the 1500s, this would have been unimaginable. However, as slavery increased and as slavery undermined the authority and positions of these African kings, they were eventually forced to engage in this. And they lost a lot of power that they once had. And there's a really interesting source I read, or a piece of history that I read from King Garcia II of Congo. He said, look, when the Europeans first came, they had horses, they wanted silver, they wanted gold, and now they only want slaves. And when will they realize that slaves aren't gold? But unfortunately, a process had started where inequality within their relationships started to grow. And this inequality grew where it started to favor Europeans, and it wasn't favorable for the African kingdoms. And meanwhile elsewhere, I always like to touch upon my meanwhile elsewhere, because whilst I think the story of Britain is important and the story of Africa is important, I think it's also important for us to know about developments that are happening around the world. And it's very important for us to know that at this time, Baghdad was probably one of the most advanced cities in the world. When we think about Baghdad now, we have a lot of negative connotations. However, back then, it was way more advanced than most medieval cities in Europe. In Baghdad, you had what was known as the House of Wisdom, which included vast libraries and schools. And at these libraries, you had scholars who studied maths, who studied chemistry, who studied astronomy, and who studied all other sciences. In fact, the people of Baghdad had far more information about medicine from the ancient Greeks and the Romans than the Europeans had. And a lot of ideas that the Europeans eventually adopted about medicine came from the Crusades when they went into the Middle East. In fact, you had a hospital built in the Middle East, or in Baghdad, in 1805 AD, and doctors worked there full time. And this was way before anything of the like was being built in Europe. Now, I think the question I've got for you guys is, why have I spent so long looking at the history of Africa? Does Africa have a history outside Europe? And how does this link to the slave trade and race? As I alluded to at the start, it's important to start teaching or even discussing the transatlantic slave trade with the story of Africa. And this is the reason why. When you're teaching students from an Afro-Caribbean background, if you start with the story of the slave trade, it hurts. It's not empowering. It's not uplifting, and you are reinforcing an idea that Africans have always been subservient. And in fact, when I was studying history, the transatlantic slave trade was probably one of the most difficult periods of history for me to study, because I was pretty interested in history. In fact, I loved history, and I studied about amazing people such as Henry VIII. I studied about the First World War, the Second World War. And the one time I came across somebody in the grand narrative, in this grand story of history, that looked like me during enslavement. Now, how do you think a young person is going to feel about that? And moving this slightly forward, looking at ideas about race. When teaching our students from European or white backgrounds, if you start the story of Africa, or start the story of slave trade, in Africa, you are reinforcing a myth, a perception that Africa has never been developed, that Africans were always backwards, that Africa was somewhat destined to be colonized by Europe. And the problem you have there is you reinforce an idea that the race was always superior to the African race. And the question is, what happens when these students now go into life? When they go into jobs or they become managers and they're confronted with an African or someone of African descent and somebody of white descent, unfortunately, because of their education, there will be an unconscious bias that someone from the white race is superior from someone from the African race. And that is the start of institutional racism, in my argument, or in my opinion. And that's why it's important to start with the story of Africa. It's important for students from an African Caribbean background to identify themselves from a positive light. It's important for students from other backgrounds to realize that Europe was a part of the world, but it wasn't the center of the world. And certainly Europe had many areas of civilization, but it wasn't always more civilized than these other regions. And finally, how does this link with the slave trade and race? Well, it links with the slave trade and race for a number of ways. Number one, the transatlantic slave trade took place in Africa. It took place between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. And this is where the idea of race came from. Now, why did the transatlantic slave trade develop? Now, when we ask the question of why something happens, in history, there are often multiple explanations or multiple reasons for this. There's many reasons, okay? Now, on the slide, you have the TAST, and the TAST simply stands for Transatlantic Slave Trade. Now, there are technological advancements or reasons around technology why the slave trade developed, and this was very important, okay? In Europe, they had developed new navigational technology, which simply meant that Europeans could travel further and could travel for longer. And this contributed to the discovery of the New World by Christopher Columbus. That was one of the key things. However, there are still arguments against this. On the right, you have the colossal heads of Olmec culture in South America. And some people have argued, I don't know if it's true or not, that this represents the connection or the exploration of Africans to South America. And I believe the Africans, they said, came from Mali. And what they point to the features of these Olmec heads as an indication. And what's quite important when looking at these Olmec heads is understanding that in the ancient times, you didn't have Snapchat, you didn't have camera phones. These were very much like portraits in the same manner that the Benin bronzes were portraits. Now, I'm not saying that Africans certainly traveled to South America. I don't know. I have no idea. But what I am presenting here is an argument around that. However, the key thing to understand is technology and exploration was a key part, is a key underlying reason in why the transatlantic slave trade developed. Moving on, as a result of the technological development and the increase in being able to explore further and being able to travel further, the new worlds were developed. Now, when these new worlds were discovered, they needed to be farmed. They needed to be farmed because there was a high demand for products such as tobacco, cotton, cocoa. In Europe, there was a high demand for this. Now, Europeans actually first tried to enslave the Native Americans, but this was unsuccessful for a number of reasons. A number of Native Americans successfully resisted, but also some Native Americans died as a result of diseases such as smallpox. So the Europeans could no longer look towards Native Americans to farm the land, to cultivate the land. They then looked to what we call indentured servants. Now, indentured servants are people who pretty much give away their services for a prolonged period of time. However, there weren't enough indentured servants in Europe. Now, some people have argued that they might have looked at Britain or might have looked at their own people. But the problem you had is you still needed people to work in the factories, okay? Cotton, cocoa, tobacco, these are raw materials, but they needed to be made into products. And these products were often made in factories, and you needed the working people to do this. So we know that, or we can see that there was an attempt to enslave the Native Americans, but they either died or they successfully resisted. There was an attempt to use indentured servants, but it simply wasn't enough. And they also needed people to work in factories. And so they looked at Africa. They had trading relationships with Africa for centuries. Not only did they have trading relationships with Africa for centuries as a result of access to gold and the growth of religions such as Islam and Christianity, but in the European context, Christianity, they'd been trading with Africans, whether it be gold and wax, for a number of years. Now, Africa's a pretty hot climate, just like South America. And the Africans, unfortunately, were well suited to working in the tropical climates of the Americas and the Caribbean. And they also had the skills that would help to cultivate these resources in the New World. And slavery already existed in Africa. However, to suggest that Africans simply sold Africans would be grossly inaccurate. And it's important to understand that this was not the case. In fact, the process behind this was rather more complex. And I'm going to try my best to explain that now. In the same way that we wouldn't say, both world wars were simply white people fighting each other. The slave trade was not simply black people selling each other or Africans selling each other. In Europe, for example, there are differences as a result of language, religion, cultural practices, social norms. A German sees himself as somebody, or would have seen himself as someone very different to an English person. So when the Germans and the English were engaged in the First World War and the Second World War, they didn't look at it as killing themselves. They were in fact killing. Now this is very similar when looking at Africa. You had kingdoms such as Benin, you had kingdoms such as Congo, you had kingdoms such as Dahomey. These kingdoms had very, very different religious practices, different social practices, different cultural practices. Somebody from Congo did not see themselves as somebody from Benin. They were different. And so when they were selling somebody, they were selling somebody from Benin. They were not selling somebody from Congo. And so they were not selling themselves. They were selling somebody from a different kingdom. And what is more, slavery did exist in Africa, but the slavery that existed in Africa was of a very different nature to chattel slavery. Now, chattel slavery is ultimately about enslaving people and forcing them into labor for profit. In Africa, slavery often occurred as a result of a number of reasons. Sometimes it resulted as a result of falling into debt. Other times it resulted from being a captive of war, okay? But being a slave in Africa was very different. They could work off their punishment. They could marry, they could have children, they could integrate into African society. they were not subhuman. In fact, it wasn't too different to medieval serfdom, for example. And basically, what happened with medieval serfdom or the feudal system, you had a system whereby you had a king. Now, the king realized that they couldn't control the land. So they would give their land to, their knights, their soldiers who helped them. And what the soldiers would do would be to promise the king loyalty. And when they promised the king loyalty, they would then get serfs to work on this land for free. Now, the serfs had to stay, they couldn't leave. And in return for the serfs working on this land for free, these knights promised to protect them. Serfdom was slightly different to slavery, but it was very similar to the form of slavery that existed in Africa before the transatlantic slave trade. But the story of the transatlantic slave trade isn't black and white. It's quite difficult, and as you read through history, you realize that black and white doesn't really exist. Good and bad doesn't really exist. There's nuances, there's shades of grey, and in order for me to get a nuance over to you, I have to tell the story of Diallo. And it's a rather interesting story. Now, Diallo was a Senegalese prince, and he was a Senegalese prince who was actually involved in the transatlantic slave trade. He enslaved and sold slaves to Europeans. However, in 1730, he was captured himself by the Royal African Company, and he was sold into slavery. And he was transported to North America, and he was forced to work on a tobacco plantation. He was forced to work by somebody called Mr. Tulsi. Now, he tried to run away from being enslaved, as most people did. But what happened was, it was discovered that he was, by a Christian minister called Bluet, that Diallo could read and write, and that he was fluent in Arabic, and he was a high-ranking Muslim prince. Okay? He was allowed to write a letter to his father, which ended up in the hands of the Royal African Company's director's hands. And they brought Diallo to them, and they sent him to London. And when he went to London, he helped to put together so many things that involved the British Museum and things around that. However, Diallo's story is interesting. Now, he was involved in the transatlantic slave trade in selling enslaved Africans. He was enslaved himself, and he found freedom. And you would think that somebody who experienced all of this would be a staunch abolitionist, but no. When he returned home in 1734, he started trading Africans again. He was involved in a transatlantic slave trade again, which I found quite challenging, but what it does is it further challenges the view. But when he started to sell Africans again, he eventually was sold back into slavery. And what you have in this story is you have a nuance, as I've tried to show. You have the understanding that Africans didn't sell Africans. There were differences in language, in culture, in practices that meant that they didn't identify, they didn't see themselves as Africans. They didn't see themselves as black. The whole concept of being black was something they became aware of when they were taken from Africa, because everyone was black. They didn't see themselves as Africans. They saw themselves in a very different way. But you still had Africans who knew about slavery and who were involved in slavery. And in spite of what they knew, they continued and they made a profit. Now, for me, when I look at the transatlantic slave trade, I look at it as exploitation on a number of levels. You certainly have the exploitation of the enslaved Africans on ships, but you also have the exploitation of the people working in factories. You have the exploitation of the sailors working in the ships. And what you have in this, however, is the construction of race as we know it. Now, my closing thoughts. Ideas around race in terms of blackness and whiteness emerged as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. Europeans did not engage in the slave trade because they were racist. They engaged in this transatlantic slave trade in order to make money. However, racist ideas were used to justify the transatlantic slave trade as Europeans struggled to accept the idea that exploiting Africans was just. From this whole process, the idea that Africans were inferior started to emerge, or black people were inferior started to emerge, and the idea that white people are superior started to emerge. And this is important because these ideas about race played a role in influencing other individuals in committing major atrocities at the time. Now, next week, we'll be looking at resistance to the transatlantic slave trade, because as I said, Africans fought against this at its very inception, at every part. The Kingdom of Congo, for example, the Kingdom of Benin, for example, who rejected and refused to sell male slaves, weren't the only one. You have other examples. We're going to look further at the abolition of slave trade and how Africans were central to that. And we're going to look at the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade. And we're going to come face to face with some aspects of history that we're not too comfortable with. Now, as I've always suggested, please follow the following teachers on Twitter. If you have any further questions, please don't hesitate to ask me. I've got 4 minutes. So in the next 4 minutes, what I will try my best to do is answer some of your questions in the group chat, because I can see so many. Okay, so the highest slave trading nation was Portugal, followed by Britain. So Portugal engaged in the highest number of trading slaves, and then Britain became the second highest. Yeah, what's good? Important to remember that the answer to the question almost doesn't matter. One person is slave and exploit one of the two. Yeah, it's very true. Agreed. Yes, stealing this, you can steal what you want. I don't mind. Yeah, they didn't sell their own people. £45 for a human. I'm not sure how much they were sold for, but we'll find out how much the slave traders were paid to, grant freedom. Troy, you want to join into the discussion? Troy, as I said to you before, you can't join into the discussion, but if you have anything you'd like to message me about, please message me, and I'll be, open to discussing it, but I can't allow that. Thank you. Where can we learn more about this topic? Wicked. Okay, 3 minutes. So, loads of books. So, where do I start? There's a book called Black History or African Kingdoms by Dan Linden. In fact, Yasmin, please add me on Twitter, and I will give you, a list of different places you can learn about it. But also, there's an A-level out there. The A-level's called Medieval African Kingdoms, and a lot of this is taught in that A-level. 2 minutes. Can you show the list of teachers? There you go, please. I guess I'll try and do that. 2 minutes, I've still got 2 good. I'm Yoruba, Southern Nigeria, and I've always been of the understanding that the slave trade in Yoruba Kingdom primarily sold Yorubas. Madame Tinubu is an example. Do you know any more about the slave trade in West Africa? Yes, I'll talk about, so like I said, I cannot say that the Yorubas or some people from the Yoruba Kingdom didn't involve in the selling of Yoruba people. But it's very complex because, for example, people in Togo speak Yoruba, and when you get into Nigeria is such a difficult question because Nigeria consists of 1 minute. I need to answer that another time, but the Yoruba Kingdom, it was the Oyo Kingdom at the time, and the center was the Ile-Ife, and it was massive, so we'll get to that. You got like the teachers to follow. Yeah, I will. Thanks for a great session. Thanks, Carlos. Love you, brother. Good question. Was the slave trade? I would definitely argue that the slave trade played a key role in the underdevelopment of Africa. That's a fact. Good question. So the whole idea of like a kingdom and a nation. The whole idea of a country and a nation state is relatively new, and this didn't come about until the 17 and 1800s. For example, England and Scotland weren't Great Britain. It took a while before these kingdoms became countries. It's a slow process. Oh, give me 1 minute, please. Troy, listen, my details at Josh Priya Garry. I'd love to chat up with you. Bacon's Rebellion. No, Maxine, I won't be looking at Bacon's Rebellion, but I've got some other cool ones. Oh man, no more. Okay. Thank you, people. I hope to see you again next week. Thank you so much. Have a lovely evening. Stop sharing. Bye, everyone.